Okay, so hi everyone, and welcome to the second episode of the fourth season now of Sheltering Places, which is the new Center for Research and Practices sort of outreach program that is organized by students and the researchers at the new center. Well, my name is Carl Olsson, and I'm joined here by my sort of co-host, Yusi Liu, and our guests for today are Una Chung and Victor Wang, joining us from opposite parts of the world. Una Chung is the professor of Media and Global Studies at Sarah Lawrence College in New York, whereas Victor is currently artistic director and chief curator at the M. Woods Museum in Beijing. So I'm just going to give some very slight background for sort of where we are coming from with this episode, which is titled Common Sins. And it's a conversation about the arts of making criteria. Before I hand it over to Yusi to sort of read our curatorial text. But Sheltering Places was originally kind of conceived as a kind of a replacement of small talk at academic conferences and sort of openings at exhibitions and so on, and it sort of departed from that slightly and become more of a sort of interview program. But I think we were trying today to sort of go back to this sort of idea of having a quite informal conversation. So we're going to begin with some formality, and then we're sort of going to possibly sort of veer off into more chit chat. Over to UC before we sort of invite Una and Victor to sort of join us properly. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Yusi Liu, and I'm currently in Beijing, and I'm a student and a researcher at a new Center for Research and Curatorial Practice, and I'm going to read our curatorial text before we set out to begin. So the second episode of Sheltering Places, Season 4, will be a live and discursive inquiry into the following tentative proposition about the common sins proper to the participants' professional and disciplinary context. The proposition is that critical and curatorial practices both belong with disciplines like cartography and architecture as arts that establish, mediate, and judge against criteria in the spaces they enact and colonize. Departing from this idea, the participants will discuss whether and how they are purveyors of sins in the sense that they ineluctably and inadvertently peddle criteria in their respective ways for what constitute desirable and undesirable or sinful behaviors, bodies, and practices. To this end, the episode will be construed as an experiment in which the participants will work towards modifying, contextualizing, and elaborating the tentative propositions with reference to anecdotes from their own work. So Carl will start the first anecdote.
Thanks. And sorry for sort of taking over in the beginning, but I think it's fair if we sort of begin giving some context about where we came from in making this proposition, which we will go sort of work around. This is really a very practical matter, since sort of we were discussing what are we going to sort of, myself and Yusi, that is for this episode, and I had sort of two touching points that sort of has me thinking about criteria and sort of the art of making criteria as something that we are engaged in different ways. Myself, I am a human geographer, and I'm a doctoral candidate at Newcastle University in England, not the one in Australia. I'm also a researcher at the new center, like UC. But a few years ago, I had a chance to take a sort of a class when I was doing my master's degree in art history that was focused on global modernism. And I had never so much as sort of had anything to do with the art world really prior to that. And I walked into this room, and I was extremely confused. I walked away from the first session of that, not really comprehending what I was listening to, because to me it felt like sort of philosophy, but completely untethered to anything worldly, and sort of any sort of idea of trying to determining sort of what something is about. Sort of untethered philosophy would be my kind of description of that. And I sort of wondered what kind of criteria do art operate, sort of work with? Why is this? What is this? And different sort of within this sort of framework of both sort of modern and now also sort of contemporary art. But then I sort of more recently I've sort of had another sort of experience, and this was at the New Center for Research and Practice. It was something that was said, I think, in a presentation at one point by Mohammed Salemi, who's the director, I suppose, of the New Center. And I'm not going to sort of put too much into it as being what Mo said, but rather sort of my own hearing it sort of, and that's sort of that curatorial practice is sort of a way of holding open a space against different forces that are abroad in the world, keeping it open in order for the curator to let the artist sort of take a place within this contested space to sort of facilitate this. And I mean, for me, the connecting tissue here, I will try to not go on for too long, but the connecting tissue really is sort of the act of holding open something, but in doing so, does one not also do so after a sort of a set of criteria, which one is at least partaking in establishing and making. And I would just like finally to connect this to my own background as kind of a geographer, because I feel there is a very, very strong sort of historical connection here within the sort of particularly within sort of the European and broadly Western conception of both geography as sort of a making criteria for how different spaces should be interpreted and how they should be read, mapped, who they belong to, and so on, and this sort of enacting and a space within the museum or whatever sort of arena within one can possibly curate, and this sort of and also there are manifestly sort of more sort of tangible historical links between sort of colonialism and both geography and sort of museology and sort of the extraction of both information and sort of artifacts from different places around the world, of course, and which has gone with a great deal of violence. So this is sort of my sort of perspective in coming into this and making this proposition about that we belong in some sense together and as judges and makers of criteria that can be quite violent per se. I would just like leave you over to Yusi now to sort of tell her version, and then we can sort of begin inviting you two, Una and Victor, if that's okay.
So a brief introduction about myself. I am a graduate student in archaeology in the United States, actually, at Bryn Mawr College, and my research interests lie in the convergence of Greek archaeology, heritage, and contemporary art. And I'm also the assistant editor of the Offing magazine and currently the visiting curator at Beijing Inside Out Art Museum. So for my anecdote, I would like to talk about and share how even though we are at a beginning stage of this episode, but I want to kind of retrospectively think in this episode at the beginning and also kind of reflexively talking about how have we arrived at a structure for this episode and how this episode, why we decide how this episode will go about. So Sheltering Places is a place for people from the New Center to continue engagement with critical thinkers, curators, and artists. And we have been thinking about covering more diverse topics across various geographies. We have been thinking about, so And Una joined the new center this semester, and she will be teaching a seminary entitled Contemporary Criticism and Eastern Practices starting next week. And also with a scholarship under Woods Museum in Beijing, where Victor is a director at, and an increasing number of people from China and also from East Asian as well joined the new center last semester. So our Starting Places team therefore invites Una and Victor for the second episode, and we are very glad to have the conversation with you too. So as we were planning out this episode, Carol and I found it to be necessary to kind of also avoid a very Orientalist view, even though I am from China. And for me, it is particularly self-conflicting because of my own identities, which got me thinking a lot. And because it doesn't mean I will be an expert in reading Asia at all. And neither Carol nor my research focuses on Asian studies. And it is really a vast field and it's not a simple subject at all. And it's really involved kind of multidisciplinary. So Carol and I really want to be self-aware of our positions. And in this light, we take on this experimental format for this episode where we propose propositions in trying to learn about the methodologies of Una and Victor's in their own practices. That is how, including how aesthetic experiences can be mediated across different traditions and regions. Carol and I also will each propose a proposition. And through these propositions, we really hope to get a better glimpse of their Una's and Victor's disciplines, including the mechanisms, the problems, and their methodologies. So, and also Carl talks about global modernism. So I couldn't help thinking about global distance because I myself belongs to the people who became almost displaced from where I work and live before. And Zoom really reduces the distance, especially in the COVID era. And it offers us an opportunity to connect and creates an existence for people in multiple temporalities. But to coexist is very difficult. So it's 9 a.m. for Una and 10 p.m. for Victor and me. And as organizers of the Sheltering Places, we have been really struggling to find a time that works best for all of us. And so to coexist is very problematic at the same time. And there will always be someone who needs to sacrifice their time more to allow this multi-temporal existence. So we ourselves are creating criteria and also perhaps sins. So we really want to be aware of this, and we believe we have to be self-aware of the situation. So that's kind of my anecdotes. We invite Una and Victor to also contribute an anecdote from their own practices. Maybe Una can go first.
Hi, thank you so much for that introduction. I think my anecdote actually will resonate with what you've just said, Yusi. So I wanted to begin by remembering a moment from graduate school. So during graduate school, I actually did a lot of meditation, and it was part therapy and part research method. And I had a little meditation shrine in my room. And one day my roommate had a friend visiting from Asia, and they saw the little shrine in my room and asked my roommate, kind of concerned or suspicious. Oh no, is your roommate, is one of like those Asian Americans? And if I fill in the ... there, I think the implication was, is this someone who, fetishizes Asia? And as you mentioned, is this kind of fascination a form of self-orientalizing? And it's really interesting at that moment because I thought of the phrase Naoki Sakai uses, and which Megan Morris in the introduction to his book, Translation and Subjectivity, describes as an endless looping of the process of disclosing others' ethnocentrism. And it's kind of easy to imagine how this endless looping would go, while contemporary Koreans live very much in the modern world. And then here's a shrine, this very uncomfortable spectacle, perhaps, of an Asia that Asians have distanced themselves from. And then, you can imagine, but isn't that distance itself a kind of posture that's adapting to globalization, et cetera, et cetera? So I wanted to actually interrupt that kind of train of thought, actually, because it's a little bit of the problematic, I think, of the legacy of post-colonial discourse as it shifted from its very much political moment in the world to a much more integrated kind of everyday affect theory, if you will, today. So a different kind of question arises if one actually thinks about the meditation practice itself in light of this little moment here. So in meditation, the subject who meditates, you could say, quite ruthlessly does away with, like cuts through subjectivity. And I think an interesting point of contrast here might be Freud's notion of the superego, which was based on an analogy to the state, right? So for Freud, the superego is a state within the state. And in meditation then, the controlling agency, as it were, doesn't aspire to statehood. It's a very important point. If anything, it leads to its own death. It's a bit of a suicidal project from the point of view of subjectivity. And what is then invoked in that space of death or space of Bardo, you could say, is the free play of spontaneous affects. So for me, this thing of working with meditation and as a part of, I call Eastern praxis as actually as a way of not using the word Asian, it's kind of maybe something useful for me to note at the outset that it's not really motivated by some kind of fantasy of a state or of an imagined community, but rather I would describe it more as a really pressing need to discover different kinds of psychotechnology. And I'm just sort of borrowing a phrase that Kittler talks about in his book, Gramophone Film Typewriter from 1916, where there are modes of the mind which we identify in Kittler with film practices, but we could think more broadly of that kind of chaotic realm of art practices that Carl was alluding to. So rather than a state within a state, or this problem of subjectivity, how might we think through the body in exile, the one far from home, or the one not interested in a kind of subjective dominance? What other modes of practice might be engendered by that?
Thank you. I mean, it's already clear to me that we are coming from quite diverse perspectives, and there's a lot going on here from all three of us. And I really also want to hear Victor sort of add his perspective to sort of this plethora of ideas.
Hi, thank you. It's so good to be here with Una and the New Center and everyone. And as mentioned before, the museum did put forward some scholarships with the New Center to kind of facilitate more students from East Asia, from China also specifically, and offer them free education to attend these beautiful lectures and courses that the center does offer. I might take a slightly different approach from others. And that's because, well, let's start with some of the questions that were posed. And yes, for me, recently, I've been less interested in exhibition making and more interested in institutional development, in terms of institutional spaces and what they can offer in terms of long-term change. And I know there's been an emphasis on exhibitions and the power of exhibitions. And I think exhibitions up to the 1990s, early 2000s were actually incredibly important because of what they offered, which was alternative views of the world, alternative perspectives about the world, and what some would call world building. Or for example, Paul Gilroy might say that they offered ways into, or the deconstructing of ways, or the deconstructing of hierarchies in the world that surrounds us, by different people from different geographies from around the world. And I used to believe a lot in the power of exhibitions, but since I've started to run a museum, I've started to focus less on just the exhibition program and more about what kind of institutions can be put in place to help people. And that the artist Richard Tuttle once told me that art, is not for art's sake, but art is for life, and it's for returning to a betterment of life. And obviously institutions have a big role to play, as previously stated. The museum does come out of certain colonial practices. One could even locate it through the ethnographic practices or early kind of archaeological practices, and the desire to have a kind of encyclopedic knowledge that was born out of ideas of enlightenment and European tradition of during the age of expansion. And some philosophers have said that the power comes with naming, and that during the European expansion is when they started to name and give scientific Latin names to plants and to animals, and that kind of encyclopedic database is what kind of took away from certain indigenous types of knowledges. And how do those hierarchies today still propagate? Through museum structures, through collecting of art, through the collecting of geographies and so forth. But again, I take a very different view. So for me, I think institutions and exhibitions potentially have the power to reconstruct or re-territorize certain canons. And when I say canons, I mean worldviews that were put forward largely by the dominant institutions that had the collections or were put in power for various political reasons. I also want to be very careful with the way I use colonial practice, because I think colonialism is a specific kind of methodology that was employed through European powers and cannot be, for example, shared by Japanese imperialism that we saw during the Second World War, if we want to talk about an East Asian perspective. And I think for me, I'm less afraid to use terminology such as Asia or East Asia because, well, one, I founded an institute called the Institute of East Asian Performance Art, but I should maybe specify that for me, Asia is not a geographical location, but rather a methodology, a type of framework to think about multi-geographical spaces. So for example, in the 1980s, when Shi Daxing was in New York doing one-year performances, New York was also a part of Asia. Shi Daxing was also part of Taiwan, but he's also an illegal immigrant. Or the same way Rashid Areen would curate exhibitions like The Other Story in 1989 at the Hayward Gallery, a pivotal exhibition that showed largely marginalized voices, Black British voices, Black Asian voices. Rashid was also located in Great Britain, but he also belonged to South Asia and to other kind of diasporic communities that kind of fold the distances between certain geographies. So for example, London was a part of Asia, or the relationship, say, for Ginkin Kobo, the Japanese theatrical group, experimental group with Bauhaus, or say, and the list goes on. Nam June Paik is another incredible figure that folds these spaces into two and complicates the idea of these geographies or Asia or Korea being a singular identity rather than a multiplicity of both time and space. And so I put forward the idea of hyphenated identities or hyphenated spaces. And that does come from people like Rashid Areen, that comes from people like Stuart Hall, that comes from people like Kobina Mercer, who talks about the burden of representation. I don't want to have the burden of having to represent Asia or China or any of those forms. Of course, Kobina Mercer was speaking about Black British representation at that time. But I believe in the hyphenated position, which is a non-dualistic position, something that operates in between the two. So for example, Rashid Areen's exhibition was called The Other Story, African hyphenated Asian, modern and contemporary art. And I believe in that hyphen between the space. And that hyphen between the space, I think, allows for a multiplicity to occur that encompasses the complexity of diasporic living, but also the very complex forms in which technology, trade, and culture both manifest and change over time. And I do want to emphasize that I also believe this is non-linear. I think this is a trans-temporal position to take, because we know that, for example, contemporaneity, I would dare say, is not a linear process, nor is modernity. You know, if someone's speaking about a global modernity, we can't specifically say there's a global point in which, you know, modernity began. And the same is true for contemporaneity. You know, contemporary as a term does not even enter European discourse until the 1950s, late 1950s. However, in China, the term is adopted as Dangdai Yishu, and it's not used till the 1990s. So, you know, and of course, you know, and there's wars and different implications, both sociopolitically and geographically, that delineate these differences. But I do think it's a trans-temporal difference that needs to be accounted for when we speak about why we need these multiplicities to be accounted for when we talk about contemporaneity, institutions, exhibitions, global modernity, and so on and so forth.
I mean,
Thank you,
yeah. Sorry, you go ahead.
No, go ahead. I think you have questions.
No, you can go.
Okay, then we'll move to our proposition, and which Victor already addressed some of it, but I'm just going to provide it and also add my own kind of aspect to it. So I mentioned earlier that we are going to provide 2 propositions, which will be elaborated each by Carl and I, and then our panelists will, Victor and Una, will respond to it and provide some ideas. So the first proposition we have is critical and curatorial practices both belong with disciplines like geographies and architectures as art that establish, mediate, and judge against criteria in the spaces they inhabit and enact. So I would like to refer to Sun Ge, who is a researcher at the Institute of Literature, Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, who is a well-known figure in the East Asian intelligentsia. So in her recent book, Asian Moment, which was published in 2019, she argues that Asia, where Asianness is a compound concept of the socio-political, historical, this, which really echo with what Victor said about is not limited to a geographical space. So, and etymologically speaking, the word Asia really first refers to people in Asia Minor in antiquity. And it was not until the 12th century during the Crusades that Asia became to serve as the other to the West in the rise of the European colonialism. So it thus became a concept to differ from the West by the West. But after the Second World War, the idea of Asia is not just an imposed construct by and from the West, but it was subjectively transformed into a symbol for self-identification. And namely, the Bandung Conference of 1955 marked Asia as one political unit, but the scene changed in 1980s when the Cold War arrangements started to crumble and different countries in Asia began to pursue modernization, which is a new form of colonialism in a way. And Sun Ge really argues that what constitutes Asia, what she proposes Asian is a set of principles. And to study Asia is to investigate these principles and what they are and their mechanism. And she also proposes Asian as a principle, which is like what Victor says, and Asian as a methodology, that Asia needs to have its own principles to be fully understood and not seconded by the Western hegemonic frameworks. So I'd like to consider these principles as the building blocks for what we are thinking as the criteria each discipline creates and protects and also reacts to. So in this regard, I would like to hear what Una and Victor each thinks about this conception of Asia through their own discipline. So to Una, who is through a perspective, who works outside Asia but works on Asia, what are the criteria in your own critical inquiries in Asian American literature and in Asian American and post-colonial literature and new media studies, and what are their problems, especially in the context of you're in Western academia, where you were educated and now do research and teach courses at? And also, kind of put differently, how do you approach Asia and what are the shortcomings?
Thanks, Yusi. I have to begin by responding just for a moment to Victor, because Victor, I just love the image you conjured up, like really fast, of like, that's a world, like that's an Asia I want to belong to. And that this trans-temporal world where we actually question contemporaneity. I love this, because questioning this use of present, it was a way of countering the colonial, relegating everyone to the past. But it isn't so easy, contemporaneity, right? It's not just about matching up time zones. And inhabiting the hyphen between spaces, not just the hyphen between words, but between spaces. I just want to say I love it. And I'm really excited that you began by saying it's not just the power of exhibition you use, but actually the shift from that into institutional modes of world building. I mean, that's kind of the point. This is how you change the world. This is how Asia actually does regain a kind of dynamic materialism and reshapes itself. At that point, one has to wonder why the fuddy-duddy academics have to track that history. So I'm suddenly feeling, oh, I'm a bit of a fuddy-duddy academic here, but I'm going to do it because it might be a useful exercise. But I just have to begin by saying how excited I am to hear how you started us. And I kind of want to jump there quickly, but I did prepare some thoughts about the propositions because I found them really interesting. So maybe we can pull all this stuff together. Okay, great. So, I read this little piece by Seung-ge on the Korean poet Lee Chung-hwa. And in that piece, it describes Lee Chung-hwa, who was a Korean poet born in Jeju Island, but lives in Okinawa. And Seung-ge points out that Lee Chung-hwa really kind of pulls together Jeju Island, Gwangju, and Okinawa. So it's an interesting kind of place within Asia. I would say it's sort of like the dark mirror image of this trans-temporal place Victor's talking about. And I'm wondering if there's a way, there's a little portal between these two moments, And so I just want to talk a little bit about that piece because I just find it so moving. So Seung-ge's imagining this incredible moment when the word Asia rises for Lee Chung-hwa. And the poet uses it not, in like anthropological terms as an expression of belonging and imagined community, but it's actually in the ashes of that possibility caused by trauma and state-sanctioned violence within Asia. It is a little bit different, as Victor mentioned previously. And it's when Lee Chung-hwa contemplates the fate of those who live at the border as being one of dying far from home, that then she recognizes the importance of not letting death die. It's like really powerful. And at that moment, she asks this question, I can't let go of the feeling that in order to not let death die, you need people. And this feeling, she says, shall we call it Asia? So this Asia is not at all that geopolitical realm that the Orientalists kind of carved up and mapped and put in the archives and extracted from. This is like this really other moment. And it's interesting to me, like from a poetic point of view, that this word Asia is like reborn as Carl, this is truly the free-floating signifier here, but like out of nothing, like almost out of the impossibility even to define exile, right? So again, that hyphen between spaces, which are like quite ambiguous. They're not just formations, they're actually spaces for formation and deformation. And so, you know, I thought I would actually, at this moment, show a couple images from a contemporary Chinese American artist that I've been in dialogue with for a very long time, to get at this question of like this sort of strange poetic moment of Asia, because I feel this artist also had a moment when Asia, like literally that word arose, and it doesn't make sense in the context of Asian America or ethnic studies or post-colonial. And I feel it's this longing for the world that Victor actually painted. You know, it's actually this trans-temporal, like I want to almost call it, it exists in a place maybe of suspension or futurity or collective making. So I'll just show an image, because this artist, I just want to show a paired image of, the artist's name is Tishan Su, and I wanted to show an image of a work that he made outside Asia, using Yusi's proposition in New York, and then the work he made inside Asia from Shanghai. And I think it's really significant to kind of notice aesthetically what happens to his work, and also to contemplate the interval in which one could actually move from an outside to an inside, and what that even means. So I'll just quickly share screen for a moment. Okay. So this is the image made outside Asia. I'm just going to go with the Ichonghua formulation here. So please try to hear it in like a poetic sense. And then here's the one that Su makes inside Asia. And I think it's really intriguing to look at what's the same and what's different. Because there's a way in which his practice is very consistent and very rigorous. It's not like, oh, I got interested in this, now I have this totally other project. I would say they're really continuous. And if, you know, I don't have time now, but if you knew about his art practice, like you would know the tremendous amount of kind of artistic knowledge and fabrication process and so on that's required to make these. So you can notice a lot of commonalities, and then you can also notice what enters into the frame. And I'll just do one more pairing. Outside Asia, inside Asia. So I guess what I am trying to kind of raise through these images and working with the proposition around Asia, as it were, is to think about, you know, you asked us to think about some of the problems in our field. I would say, you know, in the Asian American context, the problem is that an actual, like Victor was saying, an actual institutional movement, you could say, was born in '68 when humans in North America decided we are Asian American. There was a moment of self-naming. And then that movement ended about 7 years later in the mid-'70s. Now, did the term go away? No. Did it become something else and it continues to exert a kind of social power? Sure. But in terms of a kind of concrete movement, historical movement, it's very brief. And yet what will sort of haunt, it's kind of hard, you can't not use the word, Asian American artists ever after, is the question of what does it mean to be an Asian American, and are you, and looking at the work to find the answer to that. You know, that's sort of what my anecdote was trying to call up. And for Tishan Su, it's really interesting because until you see the work that comes from Shanghai, you wouldn't know how to see in the earlier work where this question of Asia is appearing. And so I won't say too much more, but I just want to make one more connection going back to Yi Chonghua's work. She did some interesting sound work where her idea was actually not to use sound to capture, recuperate, or even recover a broken voice. She's like, no voice. You know, it's kind of like Sue saying no subject. And for her, sound then becomes a medium, right? So she uses a needle to like capture the body itself, like a female body. So that's a very different kind of sound. I think it even goes beyond Roland Barthes' notion of the grain of the voice, where you hear kind of like the throat in the voice. You don't just hear the semantics of the words spoken. And so she wants to go more into the body. And I think what has in some ways eluded critics and audience members from understanding Sue's work is simply the fact that they're kind of asking the wrong question, as it were, trying to figure out where's the question of identity. And but actually the artist's own narrative is quite clear that, you know, these images are really, you could say, like Yi Chonghwa's needle registering the sound of the body. It's really kind of presenting what is the body of those who are not sort of the normative figure of psychotechnology in the kind of heroic history of film, but like, what are these other kind of bodies who might live in that kind of hyphenated gap? And what kind of technology do those bodies conjure for us? And I think I can just stop there. And I'll just add one last point, that between the two images, of course, you can see there's not just in terms of the thematics, but in terms of the materiality of the work, you can see the history of technology. And there's a way in which the artist's own life, like his career over decades, is the time-based medium in a kind of long duration performance art sense that marks the history of technology. So I think that's very different from the moment from '68 where people wanted to take the objectified, almost abject self, and then redirect a spectacle of shame into mobilizing political action. I mean, it's a really powerful method, and it's still one today, but it isn't the only one. And it can actually really mislead one from understanding the work of someone like Sue, who's really, like Yi Chonghwa, kind of hunted by the echo of this word Asia and trying to figure out what that means.
Am I able to respond and contribute?
Yes, absolutely.
Please go ahead.
It's so nice to hear Una's thoughts on this. I think you know, the perspective of this Asian American identity is so important, and because it's diasporic thinking, and it's part of, you know, it's funny. I mean, the term itself, again, I was discussing before about Asian-American and trying not to occupy either Asia or America. But I do think the Asian American or Chinese American, Japanese American, Korean American, however you would like to identify, is such an important experience and chapter of the expanded geography and history that constructs a sense of Asianness, if there is such a thing. And also this idea of that chapter, or that, say, that tangential line that corresponds to, say, an art history from Asia. And histories, because there's a plurality. And I didn't know that we could share images, but I was so stimulated by what Una was saying about sharing art, and I think she's right. I think we have to return to the art, because I think the artists are providing worldviews and perspectives that are incredibly important to what both exhibitions, curators, philosophers, and all of those in the humanities are trying to speak about. And I just wanted to say there's something that came to mind that I've been dealing with as of recent in my own practice. And it's something that Dipesh Chakrabarty said. And he said that history as a construct belongs to the West. And his proposition was saying that really the idea of history itself, the mechanisms, the language, the terminology, the very measurement of histography is a European invention, a Western invention. And he goes on, but I kind of delineate from there and then say, well, if that is true, then how do we then construct the non-histories that are required to speak about the spaces that were marginalized or left in the non-space or the non-histories? And so if I can quickly riff off of Una and the discussions and share an image or two, things that I think maybe, I don't know, can you see this?
Yeah, we can. At least I can.
Can everyone see this image? Okay, so this is Wu Shanzhuan, and he's peeing in Duchamp's urinal. This is a work from the 90s. He's an artist, but he's, you know, a Chinese artist, but of course he was based in Europe for a long time. But this idea of trying to re-territorize, reconstruct, or deconstruct, and this is an important differentiation that Spivak makes, where she says it's actually within the deconstruction you find a reconstruction, right, via Derrida, but Spivak being the first to really a student of Derrida. But I think here you see him peeing in Duchamp's urinal. Of course, Duchamp was the first to kind of place the ready-made into a level of high art, that kind of flipping, that inversion of material and concept that you see in the urinal. But then this Chinese artist who, and I should again specify that both, say, modernity and contemporaneity within a Chinese context occurred largely outside of institutional structures. And I wrote an essay loosely around this that I called Modernity Without Museums, right? Because the Contemporary Art Museum as an institution, is a fairly new invention in China. In fact, commercial galleries are older than museums. And to extend on that, in fact, most museums, 90% of them, M. Woods included, are private initiatives and not state-backed things. And I should say this because, you know, globalization is not an even process, nor is the internet, nor is access to information, nor is contemporaneity or modernity, in my perspective. In any case, for me, this work really summarizes a kind of conflict in being confronted with a certain type of legacy and an attempt to be in dialogue with, but simultaneously deconstruct. From there, I want to speak about my ideas of an expanded sense of Asia as occupying Europe. And of course, you can go further back to the trade between Italy and China, the Meiji period of Japan and Portugal and so on. But I wanted to go here with the Yamawakis, who were students at Bauhaus, the Japanese students who attended Bauhaus, who were, they were students of Annie Albers, of Joseph Albers, and many of you will know, but this cross-cultural exchange that was occurring both pre and post-war, which is important in constructing why an Asian history encompasses Europe, but as well as why European history encompasses Asia. And to move on from there, I mean, of course, I could say more about Annie Albers, Joseph Albers. Themselves were pseudo archaeologists, in fact, often going to South America. Annie Albers and Joseph Albers had huge textile collections, Andean, Aztec collections, understanding indigenous weaving knowledges that they would then incorporate into their modern contemporary practices, and then would teach their students at Bauhaus, how these languages were then co-opted and adopted by European methodologies, and then reinstated into the teleology of European practices and knowledge. And then moving on from there, I love this image, D.T. Suzuki. I mean, many of you will know this, but this idea of silence, again, being somewhat a European invention or notion, being introduced by John Cage's famous 433 piece. But of course, we know that D.T. Suzuki, being a Buddhist monk and scholar, one of the first to translate Zen Buddhist texts into English, was also, I believe, a visiting lecturer at Columbia, had many students and artists visiting him at that time, one of which was John Cage. and the influences of Zen moving into America, the wave of Zen both in the poetry scene, the performance scene, but also, I was thinking about this idea of sin that was introduced by the New Center, and I was raised Buddhist, and I said, for me, it's more karma than sin, and this idea of rather linear but cyclical time, right? And I think that this photo, in a way, is a beautiful representation of D.T. Suzuki, even via India, via China with Chan Buddhism, into Japan with Zen Buddhism, into America, and so on and so forth. And that then returning again via Pike, via incredible Korean, as Una was talking about Korea, the pioneers of Korea, Kim Koo-lim, who did the very first new media art, video art, I should say, experimental video art in Korea, or his peers like Park Hyung-ki. Park Hyung-ki was a very fascinating figure. He's a contemporary of both Nam June Paik and Kim Koo-lim, but also had to flee Korea during the Park Chung-hee dictatorship and spent time in Japan, like many artists did. In fact, Huang Rui, one of the original members of the Star Group, many people locate the Stars Xing Xing group in China as the beginning of contemporary art in China, although there's a lot of debate around that. But he himself also had to relocate from China and spent a large time in Japan. And so there's a very large interregional dialogue that needs to be accounted for between the region that is largely overlooked. But I love this image here and this idea of cyclical time. Another image I want to return to is one of my favorite scholars, W.E.B. Du Bois, here shaking the hand of Mao Zedong. And we know through research that there's been an incredible legacy of Black intellectual thought in China. Black intellectual and revolutionary thought in East Asia, in fact. And in fact, China was very much influenced and supportive of Black revolutionary thinkers. In fact, we know that Huey P. Newton, one of the founders of the Black Panthers, was offered asylum in China after he was he was arrested for supposedly killing an officer, but was later not charged. But he was freed on bail and went to China and was offered political asylum. And in fact, the Chinese party at the time, the political party, recognized the Black Panthers as a legitimate political party. And this was during the time when the ideas of the third world solidarity was really important in the late 70s, and how communism seemed to be a new revolutionary ideology that would overthrow Western imperialism. But I think this image here is so important because there's two things that are occurring amongst the many. Here is when I believe Du Bois, through the influence of Asia, includes Asians within his theory of the colored line. He has a very famous quote about the colored line, that being the major issue of the 20th century around, Black people, and also he includes Asians in a revision. And I think this is after his travels through East Asia and through China. Of course, we know that Shirley Du Bois, his wife, is also buried in China in the Revolutionary Cemetery. So there's a reason why W.E.B. Du Bois's wife is buried in China, and the legacies between China and even Black solidarity in America, or Asian American solidarity, which expands into the realms of racism and so far. And the legacies go on, and I can continue on this topic. I wrote a short text about it for art form that I called Black Maoism, but I won't go into detail about that here. I want to just continue through these images. And then this idea of an Asian American, Canadian Asian, these identities are so interesting to me, and how they are formulated. But the great Lao Shi, the great teacher, the great performance master, Xie Daxing, for me, occupies a hyphenated space. Although he was born in Taiwan, he jumped ship in Philadelphia illegally immigrated into America, and for, I believe, over 14 years was an illegal immigrant. He was neither American nor Taiwanese. He had no passport. And in fact, during this time, as an illegal immigrant, a kind of suspended state, he created his most famous one-year pieces, where each performance would last a duration of 1 year. Here, for example, his famous rope piece, where he was tied to his collaborator for 1 year, his cage piece, and so on and so forth. So I had a conversation with Shida Xing the other day, and he said to me something which I want to share to my colleagues here. He said, Victor, an illegal immigrant is an identity. And I had to pause and I had to think to myself, okay, that is an identity that's no longer geographically located. And through the art and through his experience did I become aware that these identities are actually, they coexist simultaneously alongside racial, geographical, and other types of identities. And in fact, a lot of people don't know this, but he often would go by the name Sam during his performances. And Sam was an alias he used so the police wouldn't know his real name. Again, I'm only in recent years is he slowly divulging this information. Thankfully, there he is in his cage that he built for 1 year, in which he stayed, and he did not write, read, talk, or listen to music for 1 year while he was in this cage. Again, I think a very important piece when we think about the current global condition in terms of isolation, in terms of quarantine, in terms of the state in which many people find themselves today. And Una brought this interesting talk. She said an interesting thing is, what is the body? What does the body look like? Of this kind of these hyphenated identities, types of practices, and these complicated scenarios. And for me, one of my great heroes is obviously the great artist Wilfredo Lam. Wilfredo Lam being the Chinese-Cuban artist who was a contemporary of Picasso. Although many people will not know his practice, but you would recognize the work as being key in the construction of a Cubist language. And this is some of his work here. Being of Chinese-Cuban descent, we know that many Chinese were sent to Cuba to offset labor, but also to support the military uprising and the liberation of Cuba during the colonial era. And you see the works here. Many scholars have identified the works as kind of reclaiming a certain colonial discourse from European ethnographic practices that took African mask and religions such as Man Ray, Dali, the surrealist who saw, say, other cultures as being primitive or the original man, and that offering new ways of expression than European forms. Here, Wilfredo Lam returning to his own language, to his own epistemologies, to express what Picasso was borrowing and using within his constructions of Cubism. Again, I will just quickly, there they are together, contemporaries. This actually also reminds me of an important exhibition, which is the Primitivism exhibition that happened in MoMA in 1984. And I think when we speak about criteria or types of forms of knowledge, I think curating is such an early field. It's in its infancy. But if it does have a type of criteria, it'd be rooted within the exhibition. The exhibition as both a format, but also as a type of knowledge space, a place where knowledge and ideas can be exchanged, and therefore that being the very medium and language of the curator. And I think a history of exhibitions therefore becomes by default the knowledge of the curator. Of course, art history, of course, the humanities, but also exhibition making. And I wanted to just remember the Primitivism exhibition 1984 at MoMA, where they actually included indigenous artifacts, indigenous relics next to modernist art as a way of trying to kind of compare or juxtapose as if they had some kind of shared language, which of course they don't. Many of the indigenous objects are rooted in ceremony, They're rooted in life, right? Where contemporary modern art are often separated or detached from these notions. And this is, and you know, it's in these exhibitions and within these figures that I just shared that I think we find our dislocations between a Western canon and a non-history of East Asia or any other geographical location, because the location is not necessarily significant as much as the framework in which it exists and operates within.
I mean, I just want to respond to briefly to and sort of pause for a moment, maybe, because we have about 30 minutes left, and this has been sort of the richness of both of what you have said, sort of in response to both our proposition and to one another, and to what Yusi said before has been sort of astounding to me. I'm slightly stunned. Okay, so just to sort of gather this together a bit, I think there are a few things for me that are sort of very, very, very interesting in what has been said so far. One is sort of the hyphenated line between terms, and what I wonder about very much is sort of, according to returning to the idea of criteria, according to what criteria perhaps can one draw such a line? And clearly, to me, the answer is going to be a contingent one, one that is dependent on where one is and so on, finding oneself both in a geographical and a historical moment, perhaps. And sort of trying to sort of respond to this question: where can one, according to what can one draw or write the hyphen in one's own sort of trying to make sense of one's identity? Perhaps I should say again that I don't, it's slightly difficult for myself to navigate too, given my sort of that I do not sort of my relationship to Asia as an idea is spurious. I personally I lived in Japan for a couple of years, but I'm currently in Sweden and has been sort of quite unengaged with sort of ideas of Asia. What is interesting though is sort of my initial anecdote sort of came from a seminar that took place at a Japanese university, which is perhaps interesting in this context, and my sort of manifest confusion at sort of the idea of or sort of the operations of a term such as both something like global modernism. How does one sort of reckon with this, and sort of how does one construct together, as given the sort of the multi-temporality of modernism and art, and also in sort of modernity as a historical time, perhaps. Anyway, in sort of when we talked about, just to sort of bring according to what can one draw the hyphen back a little bit, sort of to what we talked about when we sort of posed criteria making as a practice of distributing sin. This is a sort of a provocation, this episode being entitled Common Sins. Of course, sort of sin is a concept that features heavily in sort of a European, Western, Christian primarily imagination, perhaps elsewhere too, but this is with sort of this explicit reference that we sort of, or from my part at least, I sort of wanted to refer the idea of sin. And I think there is a sense in which when Victor says that it comes with a particular kind of temporality, a particular kind of linear time that is sort of inbuilt in even the concept of sin. And if the idea here being that sin is a form of criteria, according to, almost as if the sin is you have this spider's web and different threads, and the spider sits in the center of the web, and if you sort of misstep, the spider manages to bite you, and then you sort of trespassed and you have sinned. I mean, we can also go into sort of ideas of final reckonings and so on, but let's not just sort of have this very sort of image of the spider. But then for me, what is so sort of interesting is that then there is someone, whether it is a curator or a geographer for that matter, to sort of implicate myself a bit as well, who sits behind this spider, always sort of controlling it as if it was a puppet. Because in saying everything that we have said so far here now today, are we not also to some extent also making our own criteria and remaking them, and sort of trying to get out of if we want to get out of the violences of history by counterposing a non-history, or what sort of conception of criteria can we have against that which is already implicated with a history? How do we tell a different history? Do we need a different practice of criteria? And if our institutions are perhaps with their sort of, or let's begin with the exhibition perhaps rather, if exhibitions are spaces of criteria, how can sort of an institution-driven curatorial practice respond to this? By what kind of different criteria, different models of criteria can such a shift meaningfully accomplish? Is this a question that sort of makes sense? I would like to sort of pose it perhaps first to Una and then to Victor, if that is okay.
Thank you. It's a great question and a great proposition altogether, this question of sins. And I guess in a way, to get from sin to karma, you could say there's an interesting movement of thought that one could take. And it's a movement that would, in a way, shift our phrase from common sins to common sense. And I'd like to kind of lay out a few of those thoughts, but by way of a bridge, and then I'll just tell a small anecdote and then come back to it, because I think it begins to tie this together in the way, Carl, you just kind of pointed out it could, that, the kind of work, Victor, that you've been doing, especially with Black Maoism, I think is really important, because it gives us a different methodology for thinking about criteria, where it happens, how it happens in the world. Requires travel, which is not a place of identity. It's something much more in transit and ephemeral, but also very concrete and grounded in very firm political commitments. Some years ago, the Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o came to Sarah Lawrence College, and I was able to have a little chat with him. And he told me a story which he briefly mentions in the introduction to his book on Mother, but about a time when he was traveling to the Bandung conference and had a layover in Tokyo. And he was in a little bookstore, and just by chance, so this is sort of the chance, saw a little book of poetry by the Korean poet Kim Chi-ha. And that book of poetry so awoke him. And he didn't meet the actual person, mind you. It was just a poetry book in Tokyo. He went back to Kenya and started doing a very different kind of writing, which, I mean, fortunately and unfortunately for history, as it were, landed him in jail. And then he wrote those incredible novels, like with a pencil on toilet paper from prison. So I feel like a lot of the images Victor showed us really kind of come together in this story. And it also points to the fact that Kim Chia's, I don't know because I haven't researched it since then. I don't know that Kim Chia's poetry ever knew, or there was any kind of routing back of the effects. But how amazing that it could go to Kenya and become a part of that revolutionary moment. So that kind of activity is, I think, related, Carl, to what you're posing here in terms of thinking about criteria making differently. And I love the phrase that you offered us in the written proposition, that we might shift ourselves from thinking about making criteria, the work of artistic judgment, to the arts of criteria making as a different kind of practice. I just think this is so brilliant. And to that, I'd just like to say a few things, a little bit dry, about Kant, because, I think Kant is like the name we associate with artistic judgment, making criteria, and kind of in a very rigid way. So the book I want to refer to, though, is one written by Deleuze. It's the slimmest of Deleuze's books. It's so slim, and really you could just read the 5 pages of the introduction and kind of get the whole thing here. And it's a book that Deleuze called a book on an enemy. So I feel this book serves a few purposes: to talk about Kant, to talk about what Deleuze does with Kant, and to give us a kind of method for getting from sin to sense, from sin to karma. So in that book, in a nutshell, what Deleuze says is that this is a book written by an old man. It's very different from saying, I'm correcting it. Was he right? Was he wrong? He sort of says, like, look, he wrote the critique of pure reason, the critique of practical reason. We got it. Like, reason sort of dominates and orders the work of imagination and aesthetics and et cetera, and, utility, all of this, the stuff that actually I think artists have really chafed, under those kind of ideas productively. But Deleuze does something really different. Again, he doesn't do a retaliatory debunking. It's a book on an enemy, which makes it one of the most intimate kinds of writing that a philosopher or critic ever engages in, I think. And I think that's the power of post-colonial writing, by the way. So Deleuze will say that, as Kant himself is getting older and actually experiencing the sort of like loosening of the mind and of the senses, he kind of grasps his greatest idea, which Deleuze will claim is a kind of, not a correction, but more like a resolution of what was an incomplete thought in terms of pure reason and practical reason. And that ultimately, what we end up with is what, using Rimbaud's phrase that Deleuze quotes, a disorder of the senses, that the faculties, if they can be ordered by reason and by the needs of practicality, they can also actually enter into, and this is the phrase, free and unregulated relationships. I think this is what we're talking about with Black Maoism and with Ngugi finding Kim Chiha's poetry book in Tokyo, free and unregulated relationships. How do we value that, right? Because aesthetic judgment can't normally value that. That's why I started by saying, is it an impossibility, this thing of Asia? And then Victor's like, not really, not in the real world. It's actually happening. It's always been here. And so I just want to maybe like stitch this together a little bit and offer something like a rationale for the concrete possibility, philosophy always coming 2 steps behind, that this disorder of the senses is, like for Rimbaud, the future of poetry. And I'm wondering here whether it can't also be the basis of something like the arts of criteria making, where those spontaneous relationships that can occur when we understand the free and unregulated relationships of the faculties to be valid, to actually be ground for creditable ideas and notions and aesthetic judgments about beauty, about what matters. I think our word for beauty now is what matters. So I'm just wondering if this disorder of the senses might not be useful here. And it will require, though, transdisciplinary activity and study and practice. And the kind of curatorial activity that Victor was talking about is for sure very forward thinking, but also transdisciplinary in its base. And what I was saying earlier about Tishan Su and the art practice, necessarily transdisciplinary and needs to be in transit at the same time, that there is something different that the apertures of the body can register, right? In New York, those openings on his incredible screens capture like TV and bodily parts and kind of like racialized, objectified part objects. But in Shanghai, they find other kinds of images, other kinds of textures, and create new maybe sensory basis or sense data from which to build criteria. So what Deleuze sees of value in this kind of rereading of Kant is not so much that the senses can be autonomous, right? That's kind of statehood. They can't really legislate on anything, but they can be autonomous. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, or we often think heteronomy, that it can legislate itself. The senses legislate themselves. And to refer back to Sun Ge, she's kind of mentioned, actually a very commonplace, I don't have to really associate it with her, but about the Chinese filmmaker Zhang Yimou is often perceived as catering to the West. And it's a kind of little mode, you know, and the retaliatory debunking of what has to be altered in Asia's relationship to itself. But to think that question properly, I think we actually need an aesthetic philosophy that gives us the itself, like that gives that weight as a place from which to make criteria, and that there couldn't be an art of it. In terms of the arts of criteria making, I'm just going to give a list and I won't go into it, but just to give you a sense of what it might be like from my little corner of this world. I think of the moment when Frantz Fanon in Wretched of the Earth, in his piece Critique of Violence, talks about the fact that the natives in Algeria, you know, have all kinds of ritual ceremonial practices that are designed to like let off steam, right? Part of peaceful working of society. But at the moment of revolution, people retreat, they stop, they withdraw, you could say, from their own cultural heritage, because a different kind of mobilization is about to happen. Two, Eve Sedgwick, in her work Paranoid Reading, Reparative Reading, really is thinking about everyday affect theory. So for Sedgwick, affect theory just means the fact that, you know, we have emotional reasons for having the ideas that we do. It's not actually just purely a matter of argumentation and academic discourse, that actually there are reasons why certain queer theorists who are really good at anti-homophobic critique are driven by a kind of need, like a paranoid, like anticipatory need to ward off bad surprise. Similarly, she talks about the reparative as being an alternative mode. But in all of that is a thinking about something like the arts of criteria making, right? Not just the substance of the critique, but the affective dimension that drives it and is a vehicle for it. Three, Jane Bennett's work in Vibrant Matter. And I think coming closer to the institutional dimension, you know, Jane Bennett is a political philosopher, very interested in the question of how do you affect public policy. And interestingly enough, she begins by saying, it's about your relationship to a stone. Like you pick up a rock, is it alive or isn't it? That will affect the way we understand materialities to be actants, and that affects public policy. Four, kind of old school, but I'm a literature person here by training. Paul de Man, in a book maybe not read so much today, about blindness and insight. That's a book about critical writing and the weirdness of taking critical writing, criticism, curatorial writing, artist statements, this kind of work of critical writing, which we think is or isn't quite artistic or literary writing, he'll challenge that, is so much about setting up these structures of the blind reader, then the naive reader, and then trumping it, right, with the insightful critical reader. These kind of structures also speak to, I think, the arts of criteria making. And then finally, a book I really loved, which I'll be reading in the New Center class with students, Shigehisa Sakuriyama's book, Comparing Greek and Chinese Medical Literature. And it's really interesting in terms of, this is where I go back to sin, because Kuriyama points out there's no medical need for the Greeks at that moment to have developed dissection when the Chinese had developed really complex kind of poetic uses of pulse reading, except that it was a theological need, that this belief in something inside, right? Like musculature, having to cut through musculature to figure out the source is what drove that kind of move. So even in thinking about these kind of different ways of envisioning the body and philosophies of mapping the body, I think give us different ways of considering the ground of making criteria, and to actually find the criteria making itself, if we think about it less as a superego function that we're all kind of like scurrying under, and rather as our own practice in a kind of trans-temporal world, you know, a world that can foster something like Black Maoism, then I think, you know, we can actually talk concretely about what this might mean. So sorry for taking up so much time, but I just wanted to give some concrete examples. So Carl, it isn't just free-floating philosophy. Thanks.
No, don't worry. I want to, no, it's I'm going to actually play. I've already I think played the role of the puppet master here in the spider's web, because the question was actually phrased in order for you to refer to Deleuze and to give that almost that answer, because what I sort of, if we have time, hopefully we have time for another slight question, but I really want to sort of refer this on to Victor, because if there is sort of another sort of, if we can focus on the arts of criteria making and the sort of construction of affects and going from perhaps what Deleuze elsewhere calls sort of a doctrine of judgment to what he calls a system of cruelty, with reference to it's in his collection of essays on critical and clinical, to have done with judgment is the title. He refers to sort of Kafka and Artaud and Nietzsche and I think H. Lawrence, but he outlines this as sort of two very different ways of construing oneself, and sort of, and I think what is at the heart of this is criteria, whether we are dealing with sort of morality and a sort of a perhaps essentially transcendent sort of calculus of and distribution of sinfulness, or whether we are grounding ourselves in this sort of the direct arts of making criteria according to what our bodies and minds agree and disagree with it, which is sort of what the Deleuzean sort of affect theory essentially talking about. And I sort of wonder, I think if we are to do this, I think there is some, it is sort of, ends up being something very practical. And I think one has to be extremely attentive to the dangers of this sort of approach as well. And I wonder sort of, what are the dangers? What can go wrong here? Because it is very easy to cite the sort of going into the sort of this system of cruelty, where it is the body and sort of the affects on the body that matter. But do we not also sort of, how can we sort of tally with the dangers that probably also exist there? I mean, Deleuze and Guattari themselves are very sort of clear about the body without organs will not save us. It is not enough to de-stratify wildly and so on elsewhere. And I sort of wonder, I'm not sure how familiar Victor is with this sort of corpus of text, but I wonder sort of, what are the dangers with this sort of construction of hyphenation, if you will? Can something go wrong in sort of art, in the arts of criteria making, if we try to do them better?
Yeah, I think you have several questions in there, and maybe several propositions, and thank you, Una, for clearly listing such detailed criteria and offering kind of a reading list that accompanies it. I have homework to do, and I should say, I'm learning so much, so it's so nice to kind of participate in this, despite having just had a full 9 to 5 experience in the museum, and now being almost midnight here in China. And I think for me, I do believe in alternative epistemologies, and I mean epistemologies that were either deemed sinful right? Epistemologies that were marginalized, epistemologies that were deemed non-scientific, not rooted in objective truth or theory, or not rooted in aesthetic-based theory, or not rooted in an objective scientific theory of the mind or of the ego or of the id. And of course, we could say Deleuze and Guattari through the rhizome. Of course, the rhizome was always a way of indigenous knowledge through the indigenous people of Brazil. And the idea of interconnected roots being a network of many things. And so I'm going to talk about quickly, for example, a beautiful anecdote by Boaventura de Santos, who wrote Epistemologies of the South. And he once said that if I wanted to fly to the moon, then I might consult NASA scientists. But if I wanted to learn about the medical plants within the Amazon, I would consult the indigenous populations there. And I think what I'm referring to is a multiplicity of epistemologies that are being attacked daily. They're constantly being erased by certain courses or institutions that don't see them worthy, by academia. How much epistemology is lost through kind of conservative academia? I mean, how much epistemology was lost through the colonial project, through Enlightenment? And I think it's within the indigenous knowledge that was once lost is where we find the original rhizomatic, right? And it's what the great Coast Salish artist from Vancouver, Canada, Lawrence Paul Shalawaptan, who's Coast Salish of indigenous descent, he said for them, their way of life was always surreal. And then the Europeans discovered surrealism through ethnography. Right, and then that led into surrealism and so on. But their ideas of being incorporated into nature, trees being supernatural beings, the universe being alive, your relatives are the ocean, and so on and so forth. And I think when I speak about also alternative epistemologies, I'm talking about a decentering of the human focus. I think to return to Una about this kind of, again, the body, the corpus, surgery, medicine, I think a lot of it is still rooted in a kind of human-centric perspective of the world and our position in it. I want to very much champion and pursue a non-human centered perspective of epistemology, one that is more horizontally focused, with us not in the center or at the top of a certain hierarchy. And I want to just continue by sharing a few more anecdotes. So I'm going to read this one passage here by Simone Dubois, who was describing the Forbidden City in Beijing while she was in her travel memoir called The Long March of 1957. And she says, "The imperial palace does not have a restored look, nor has it an ancient one. This hesitation makes it appear not eternal, but precarious and like an imitation of itself." Right? And she's talking about ideas of restoration. She's talking about ideas of time. She's talking about ideas of legacy, and how do we freeze time or historical moments to champion certain legacies. And what I'm referring to here, which is also very much rooted in certain Chinese epistemologies, is the idea of cyclical or non-authentic objects. For example, the terracotta soldiers, there's a beautiful story about a museum that the museum lent replicas of the terracotta soldiers to a European institution, and they were infuriated when they found out that they were replicas and not the originals. But the Chinese institution said, but these are even better because they're made with newer technology, but using the same methodology. So it's not a material legacy that needs to kind of continue and outlast. It's more of a formal ideology that's important in continuation rather than the material that creates the form itself. I want to continue with a few anecdotes. This one is by Brecht, of course, the famous German playwright, and he's talking about Chinese theater. And he goes, "In Chinese theater, the Chinese artist acts as if there were no fourth wall besides the three that surrounded him. And we're talking about the fourth wall as in the performer's engagement with the audience and their awareness of the play. However, there's a great professor, Min Tian, a Chinese theater professor, who challenges this interpretation by saying Chinese theater never had a fourth wall to begin with, and thus no devices, and I'm quoting, are needed to demonstrate the absence of a fourth wall. And what I'm saying here is that already Brecht was imposing a certain epistemological view on an existing civilization and their worldview, thus framing it within how he understood them to correspond within the context of theater. And it is not until an indigenous voice says, well, hold on, no, we never considered, there were no walls to begin with. And therefore, you know, we should start from there and go on. And this continues with Professor Wu Hong, who's a famous Chinese art historian, who talks about borrowed language. And I think language is very important. The fact that we're speaking English is very important. The fact that a lot of the philosophical concepts in which you cited were probably written in European languages, and so on and so forth. So, you know, Wu Hong talks about borrowed terms. Again, I go back to this idea of contemporary versus the Chinese term 当代艺术. Or even you can say performance art, 行为艺术, which has a very different meaning in Chinese than it does in English. And in fact, the history of performance art coming out of theater, coming out of choreography, coming out of ballet in the West is greatly different than the context, the post-war context, military complex, dictatorship complex, which performance art and avant-garde art came out of Korea, Japan. So Korea, Park Chung-hee dictatorship, Japan, post-Allied occupation, China, Cultural Revolution, Taiwan, martial law. You know, this wasn't coming out of a tradition of ballet. So again, it's about these multiplicity of both histories, epistemologies, and perspectives that simultaneously need to exist, but conflict with each other, and creating those spaces of conflict institutionally. And again, I have to say, you know, I once did believe in the power of exhibitions, and I do still to a degree, but I do much more so have focus as my privilege has grown to run a museum, to believe in the power of institutional building. And that is what I did with my projects like the Institute of East Asian Performance Art, which is a hypothetical institute. It has no specific location, it has no building, and it's spread out through a mix of artists and thinkers and art historians around the world who are invested in constructing a re-narrative, a history, a non-history of performance art from East Asia. I did a similar practice with the Institute of Melodic Healing, which was looking at how institutions should care more about empathy, about you know, everything from wage to labor rights to more humane practices about how people enter institutions or leave institutions, and also the spaces in which institutions can occupy. So for example, museums didn't always have white cubes. And I don't think we need to remain on a hyper theoretical level. You know, we didn't always have a white cube. And in fact, you know, we could go on to say, you know, for me at M. Woods, I'm interested in opening a daycare. I'm interested in opening other forms of types of institutions that have different types of relations to other institutions that correspond, but also support basic living. You know, and I think at the day, we overestimate the importance of just paying rent and allowing certain people to exist within certain systems that are kind of largely being marginalized. And I think institutions could do better to kind of protect them. And I think art institutions can do the same. Let's see what else I have. There's one other thing. I'll end with another artist, one of my favorites, Rashid Areen. And he is the founder of Third Text. He was the curator of The Other Story and has an incredible legacy. And he once said to me during a studio visit that he does not believe in the contemporary, or contemporary art, I should say. And I was kind of blown away because this was like 2019. And I said, oh my God, you know, what are you talking about, Rashid? Please tell me more. And he goes, how can we speak about a contemporary paradigm until we have dealt with the colonial and racial legacies of modernity. We haven't yet even dealt with those legacies. And we see that today, you know, George Floyd, the Occupy movements, Black Lives Matter. I mean, the legacies are so grand and so institutionalized that how can we even begin to look to a space beyond before first confronting and dealing with those legacies, post-war legacies, and even pre-colonial legacies. And so that was his perspective. You know, I'm not saying I necessarily agree, but I found it relevant to the conversation, one that I'll just leave here with the group.
Thank you. I think Yusi, we kind of have to end this quite soon, but Yusi, do you have any sort of concluding thoughts from your end?
Yeah, I actually have another question, which can be answered briefly, and I hope so. But yeah, because you ended it with museum, and you know, you provided some examples on what you're doing at M Woods, and I wonder if you can talk more about how, like, because we talk about Asia, what is Asia, the kind of fluid, non geographical space, and that's very important, and we can just go on that forever and for lives. But I think I really want to pull us from like the abstract air to the down to earth and think about, like, because I'm fascinated by the idea when you say you kind of take a step back from curatorial and what the exhibition making, but going into kind of this institutional development, and you mentioned daycare and etc. But I'm just wondering, like, what kind of like issues and sins and criterias you're battling with in the context in Asia and in China, in Beijing, the capital, and what specific kind of ways are you trying to implement this like alternative epistemology?
You're trying to get me in trouble. I mean, I think too often within panels, within the art world, they believe that the world is somehow speaking and seeing from a left liberal, democratized perspective. And I love to remind people that I have to use a VPN to access Zoom. I have to use it, you know, Google is banned. I have to use a VPN to access my Gmail. And I think this is important because when I speak about knowledge and how knowledge is accessed or filtered or even scrutinized, what is the role of search engines in providing information to European students today? What is the role of Google, you know, meta tags and so on and so forth? You know, Facebook is banned. Instagram is banned. But I'm not saying that they're not alternatives, because there are rich alternatives. But what I'm saying is that we cannot assume a kind of a linearity, a blanketing of these terms, and nor can we political structures and how museums operate. Our museums cannot operate in the same way that museums operate in London or in New York, but yet we are somehow judged under similar criteria, which is, I think, again, ridiculous. So again, you know, I don't even want to say names, but I love certain large institutions which are, you know, which have set certain standards and hierarchies. But I feel that it's not right for institutions in China to try to replicate those standards and hierarchies. And in order to participate within an industry that is uneven and unevenly distributed and unevenly representational and so on and so forth. So what I would like to propose, and one of the reasons why I joined M Woods and I was very excited by it, because it is a young Chinese museum. The founders are Chinese. It's a millennial museum. The founders are roughly my age. They're in their early 30s. They're thinking differently. They grew up between regions. They are, you know, we're not talking about a scenario where a European export was brought into China and introduced an institutional structure or validated it for Western minds to accept and do business with. No, we're talking about something very different. I'm also very excited about the position of not just M Woods, but other museums in China for the fact that they engage with audiences differently. So again, a majority of my career, I was very excited to speak to the highly educated few who were my peers. And then after taking over at the helm of a museum, I started to reconsider, who am I speaking to and who is my audience? Am I speaking to a very privileged few who could afford the courses or the beautiful schools that offer the knowledge and the language that one needs to describe the world around them within art and culture? Or do I want to speak to a majority audience that doesn't have access to this? In fact, a majority of which has never seen much of contemporary art in their lives. I'm speaking within a Chinese context specifically, but are curious nonetheless. And so, the framework both within myself and the institution has to shift within the context in which we operate. And for me, I like to stay grounded. So I just want to see, for example, museums be free. It doesn't have to be complex. I just want it to be a free, open space. I love to think about this idea of public space and accessibility spaces, the idea of educational spaces, the idea of knowledge production within institutions. How do they alter between the knowledge that's produced in universities and in other institutions? And in fact, the museum already is a radical proposition within a largely state-run country that does not support contemporary art. Again, there's maybe one or two out of the maybe 100 museums that are publicly run, right? So a majority of which are privately run initiatives. So without private investment, there would be no institutions or museums in China, generally speaking. So, I think it's very exciting. It's incredibly exciting because the context change. And what I was saying was the museum is a radical proposition because of that, because there's very obvious things, China is not necessarily a place where one has the freedom of speech, for example, or the freedom to share ideas openly. There's certain obstacles and certain barriers to expression that have existed for a long time. And I'm not necessarily criticizing that. I'm saying that these are the parameters in which an institution born out of certain European legacies is trying to rethink and restructure itself within this context. And so for me, I find it incredibly exciting, but I do worry that a lot of the museums that do get championed within China are those that successfully replicate the larger institutions in Europe, whether they be high academic in their output, or the types of artists in which they engage with, or the types of even language in which they use. And so M. Woods specifically has in the past dealt with larger publics and a less kind of high-end academic realm. And I think that's intentionally so, because I think too long has the institution, like the university, has held academia out of reach, like contemporary art, or even the barriers of entry into participating into contemporary art, which there are many. Too long institutions have supported those barriers of entry. So that if that answers your question, I think that would be some of the elements that I consider on a daily basis.
Thank you, Victor. Yes, I definitely agree with that because I'm working part-time in the museum here. I think a public-facing intention is very important. And as time is wrapping up, and I know it's getting very late for Victor and me, so I'm going to end this conversation. And thank you all for joining and sharing your side of stories with us in this episode of Sheltering Places. Yes, thank you very much. And we hope
thank you, everyone,
for engagement with you in the future.
Thanks, everyone.
See you, Una. Thank you so much.
Have a good night and have a good morning in New York.
Yeah, that was great, everyone. Thank you.
Everyone.
Humbled.